homes, prisons, and universities. I just wondered, those are pretty diverse audiences. I just wondered how Bonk stacked up against them.
You guys are great. I don't think you're prisoners, are you? Nick doesn't hold you hostage, right?
Of the mind.
Of the mind, yeah. Well, you read that book.
Yeah.
You guys are great. I love coming here, and what I love about all of you, what I love about this audience is that it's very diverse, both in terms of ethnicity and also age. So that, to me, is important. In all of my work, those things are very important. So you guys are lovely as far as I'm concerned.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
In Oklahoma, I'm sure you still have contacts there in the art scene.
Mm-hmm.
How has the 21st century shaped emerging young artists to either stay there and tell the stories of Oklahoma, or is there urban Oklahomies like yourself who are also telling stories?
Well, I was just there last week, actually, and you know, there's a state arts council that's trying to do its best to diversify artistically, you know, and there's a great art scene in Tulsa. There's a burgeoning art scene in Oklahoma City. Actually, there's a great art scene, visual, music, dance, theater in Oklahoma City, Tulsa as well. You know, Oklahoma's odd. It's a very, very conservative state. And so these scenes, these communities are large and growing. They're not receiving, most folks aren't receiving a lot of, you know, arts council grants, or not really necessarily pursuing arts council grants. Some are. The visual artists very much so. The visual arts are very well supported in Oklahoma, particularly in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa. So I'm always pleasantly surprised that they're very, very vibrant arts communities. They're small, you know, compared to a Racine or a Milwaukee or a Chicago. They're small, but they're there, and they're using their art and their voices to try and stay sane and you know, speak truth to power like everyone else everywhere else. You know, I'm always encouraged. Okay, I see two hands in the back. We'll start with you in the red sweatshirt, sir.
First, a quick announcement. Some of you know Rick Olson, was a loyal Bonk person, and he succumbed to a brain tumor, and his funeral is going to be on March 9th. At 1 p.m. and you can talk to me or Nick if you want to know where. But my question to you is, if you put your teacher's hat on,
Okay.
words of advice for people trying to be poets.
Read everything. And most especially read contemporary poetry. I think that there are many folks, and I told my graduate students this last night, that there are many folks who are steeped in the poetry of the Beats or the Black Arts Movement or the women's movement and the flowering of women's literature in the 70s and 80s. But don't know who Terrence Hayes is, right? Who don't know who Tracy Brimhall is. Folks who are writing and doing very interesting work today. So know what's going on. Know, you know, on whose shoulders you stand for sure. But know what's going on in contemporary poetics right now. I think that's critical. And then I think for poets in particular, I think that we have to feed ourselves with other art forms and other forms of information as well. I'm a news head, I'm a political junkie, and I'm a student of history, so I'm always paying attention personally to what's going on in the world, what's going on in the city, what's going on in the region, and its roots. right? So I think it's important as poets that we are fed by a variety of different disciplines: dance, theater, visual art, film. All of those things sort of affect how we see. So, and I think probably the last thing would be that we see is we have to teach ourselves to see with things beyond our eyes, right? That as poets we have to learn how to see with our ears. We have to learn how to see with our hearts, because all of those types of sight inform our language, and not just our word choice, but our syntactical choices, our aesthetic choices as well. Does that help? Okay. And yes, sir, in the back. Yes.
Just to refresh my aging mind, is Silkwood case still open?
You know what? Yes. No one was arrested for her murder. It is still open. It's a great question. Think about that. Yeah, it's still very open. You know, it's sort of like we think that maybe the government had a hand in it. You know, who knows? But yeah, it's still open. Yes.
What's the editing process like for you once you finish writing? Do you ever go back and like take this out here, or do you find the editing process like super complicated for the writer? So I just
I think that the editing revision process is the most important part of the creation process. And I see it as a part of creation, not as a part of sort of the grunt work. I see it as a part of the creative process. And yeah, I mean, probably the poems that I shared with you all tonight that are in this book each of those poems probably went through at least 10 to 15 drafts, from initial idea to completion. And not only 10 to 15 drafts from my hand and my eyes, but 3 to 4 people whom I trust as editors also filtered through their brains as well. So I love the revision process. I love the editing process because I think it's as important as the initial spark. And I think that for some reason many of us have got it in our heads that they're two different things, but they're really they're part of the whole. And if you can hang on to that concept, you'll have fun with editing. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Kind of going back to the teaching poetry in prisons, I wondered if you could just elaborate on your experiences with that. Were you developing the curriculum for it, or was it more just volunteering for it?
Oh, I've done both. I'm going to be back at the Juvenile Detention Center this Thursday, working with young men. I've been in some maximum security prisons. Most of those visits have been sort of one-offs, coming in, teaching a workshop, hanging out for a few hours. But I've probably been in Illinois, I've probably been in about 3 to 5 different prisons multiple times, some in upstate New York as well. And I generally come, and read, engage in conversation based on the poems, and then we engage in some sort of writing workshop. Either one I've developed or one that develops organically from the conversations that I have primarily with young men. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Sure. What comes of the poems after the prisoners write them? Do they have their own readings and presentations of them, or is it just more for their own?
It's both. Yeah, it's both. I've been in situations where I've been invited back for readings. Some folks have published the work, which happens somewhat frequently now, and audio recordings. But most often than not, there's a reading at some point sometimes I'm able to make it back for those, and sometimes they happen without me. There are a couple of prisons that have an ongoing poetry workshop, and I have a good friend in New York City, an amazing poet and performer named Breon Bain, who runs a writing workshop at Rikers. He's been doing that for about 10 to 15 years now, and I think he's there every other week. So all sorts of modes, I've experienced all sorts of modes and models, but I know that at Rikers with Breon, they meet without him. You know, they meet every week, and I've experienced that sort of that as well. And in my experience, the men, I've mostly worked with men, and the men, for them, it's both cathartic and necessary. And like most of us, I think, an act of survival in some ways. You know? Yeah. There was another hand up in the back. Yes, dude.
Yeah, I was just wondering for writers or especially people who haven't been writing for too long, like sometimes it's hard deciding what's important to write about. So I was just wondering, to you personally, how do you pick what's important to you?
Everything is important. It's about how much time you give to what, when, right? And so I think the answer, my initial answer to your question is, what's most important is what's burning inside your heart and your brain in that moment. And to always have a journal with you, so you can write down ideas that come. You may not get back to those ideas for weeks, but you have them recorded, archived somewhere, and you can get back to them. I think that's critical. But, you know, I think that, like, I'll give you an example. I have been wanting to write a book about the Tulsa race riot for 5 years. I've done mad research on the Tulsa race riot. I've written one poem during the course of these 5 years. But it remains very important to me. It's a very alive fire in my being that I'm going to write this book. There will probably be at least one book of poetry that I'm about to complete before I get back to writing these poems. But that fire to write about the race riot is just as hot now as it was 5 years ago when I decided that I needed to do this. So I think that there are some things that are important to you that will always be important to you, and then you'll commit to that. And then there'll be some things that come up in the interim that are also hot, like hot little sparks, right? So I think more than anything is that you're able to capture or archive in some way all of these, as many of these ideas as you can. And that's why a journal, some sort of journal, use the memo pad on your phone, whatever, get it down, get the idea down in some way, because you can always come back to it. But if you don't, it's gone, and then you'll wish you had, and the moment will be over. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yes?
Can I get one more? Can you say something about the poet as a prophet?
That sounds like a Hayden Carruth essay. It actually is a Hayden Carruth essay. You know, Hayden Carruth, and I quote this all the time, but let's see if but usually it's on paper. Let's see if I remember. That there was a time when our poet was our oracle, not our spokesman, our advocate, you know, and not our politician. And you know, my personal belief is that I don't want to tell you what to think. I want to move you to think, right? We have enough preachers and politicians and pundits and Paul Ryans to try to tell us what to think. I want my art to move you to think and possibly to act, right? But I want it to move you to that, to reach those conclusions, right? And so, you know, I think there is a great difference between a prophet, right, and you know, spokesperson speaking on our behalf. Walt Whitman wasn't necessarily speaking on our behalf. He was speaking his truth and his opinions about the Civil War, racism, or what have you, in his time. And some would consider Whitman a prophet of his moment. And I would say that there's some valid reasons to support that. But the way that I see it is that Whitman and many others today are writing about what's happening now and shedding light to these moments that others may not see or pay attention to or want to see. And I do think that that is part of the function of the artist in society. I do. But I also think it's our function to guide people to it and let them figure it out. As opposed to say, here it is, this is it, get it. Did you get it? Right? Yes?
Like you said earlier, you've been all over the world, places and whatnot. Have you ever come across, like, maybe first of all, favorite urban myths or legends? Like something that
I like the crocodiles growing in the sewer that ate New Yorkers idea. Let's see. I'm still, growing up in Oklahoma, I grew up with Bigfoot living in Boggy Creek down the street from my house. I'm still a big fan of the Sasquatch thing. I am. I don't know. That's a great question. I have to think about that. I think Bigfoot would be at the top of my list, though, since I've walked with him the longest.
That's like on your walk with God, I'm on my walk with Bigfoot.
Yeah, me and Sasquatch hanging out.
Any other questions? Going once, twice? All right, let me just remind you, Quraysh books right there for sale. You buy one, you get another free book with it. Also, I want to say before we leave, I don't always say this, but the exhibit that's up right now is really, really fantastic. So if you get a moment before you take a look at some of the works, just really excellent stuff. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Feel free to sign up on the list here, but I just really want to say thanks for coming out in the middle of Wisconsin, February. Let's give one more big fat round of applause.